interesting session in Jejuporam 2017 with the title of Why They Suffer, a reality report on North Korea's human rights. My name is Oh Jun, and I'm a professor at Kyunghee University and a former Korean ambassador to the United Nations. One day in the future, if someone decides to do a little research on the history of the North Korean human rights issue, he or she would probably find that 2014 was a very significant year for this issue. In February that year, the UN Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in DPRK came up with its historic report, which concluded that human rights violations in North Korea constituted crimes against humanity. North Korea, which had shown disregard for UN resolutions previously, changed its attitude and tried to influence the General Assembly resolutions, of course in vain. The Security Council put this issue on its agenda and held an official meeting for the first time in history in December that year. In fact, many people still remember me for my statement in that meeting in which I tried to point out that for South Koreans, people in the North are not just anybody's. These important developments in 2014 did not take place for no reasons. In the run-up to this historic year, there had been long-standing and difficult efforts by many people. North Korea's human rights situation came to light thanks to the courageous testimony by numerous defectors who started to escape North Korea from 1990s. Here we have one of the best-known people for such testimony on life in North Korea, Ms. Lee Hyun-seo. Her memoir, The Girl with Seven Names, was published in July 2015 in more than 20 countries. She has given testimony at a special meeting of the UN Security Council when I was there, and she spoke at a TED Talk which has been viewed by over 7 million people. The North Korean human rights issue would not have been received such wide reception without the role of media. We have a journalist who has dealt with North Korean issues for many years, Ms. Anna Fifield, who was based in Seoul for 4 years as a correspondent for the Financial Times some years ago, and is now the Tokyo bureau chief for Washington Post. She has been constantly reporting on North Korea, including through 7 trips to Pyongyang. We also have a key advocate for North Korean human rights who studied his work in academia and carried his torch to the Korean government and international arena, Professor Lee Jung-hoon. He is serving as ambassador at large on North Korean human rights currently, as well as the Dean of the Division of International Education and Exchange at Yonsei University. Civil society also played an indispensable role in raising awareness on this critical issue. We have Mr. Park Seok-gil, who is Director of Research and Strategy for LINK, or Liberty in North Korea, an international NGO devoted to promoting change in North Korea. He grew up and studied in the United Kingdom and has previously worked at various public and private organizations. Last but not least, 2014 will not be remembered as it is without the historic COI report. We have the protagonist who made it possible, the Honorable Michael Kirby, former chairman of the UN Commission of Inquiry on DPRK and former justice of the High Court of Australia. I thank Mr. Kirby for being here with us in this session, and I would like to kindly ask him to start this session with his keynote statement. Would you like to come to the podium?
Thank you very much, Ambassador O, and my dear colleagues on this session, and friends who have come to this very important session of the Jeju Forum. I would like to pay my respects to the Jeju Forum for the quality and interest of the programs which I've been attending and which have been informative and sometimes inspiring. I went to the opening session this morning given by the former Vice President of the United States of America, Mr. Al Gore, and I'm sure that those of you who were there also found that very informative and inspiring on the inconvenient truths that Al Gore revealed in his book of that title concerning the disinclination of people to confront for many years, many decades, the issues of climate change. Well, I'm here this afternoon to talk about another inconvenient truth, the inconvenient truth about the condition of human rights in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea. The inconvenient truths are collected in this report of the Commission of Inquiry, and this report has been before the international community since it was delivered to the United Nations Human Rights Council in March of 2014. It's been interesting to me to attend the sessions, including the sessions of world leaders, and to listen most attentively to those little and sometimes inconvenient words, human rights. My hearing is turned up to try and hear the words human rights, and I didn't hear them mentioned. I don't say that as a criticism, it's not unusual, but it is simply a fact that I draw to your notice. The closest that any of the leaders this morning came to it was the former president of Indonesia, Megawati Soekarno Putri, in her reference to the values of the Indonesian constitution on the Pancasila, the first of which is a belief in God. But belief in God is not necessarily part of universal human rights. There's also a human right not to believe in God. And therefore, universal human rights are more comprehensive and more nuanced, and they are the standard that is referred to in the opening preamble of the Charter of the United Nations and in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that followed it, and in the great charters and the developments of the United Nations since 1948. And so the only person who in the opening session today referred to human rights was the President of the Republic of Korea, President Moon Jae-in. And you'll remember that he referred to the fact that he began his life as a human rights lawyer, as I did, and that he was going to do what he could in reaching out to North Korea to endeavour to protect the human rights of the people of North Korea. So I was glad to hear that that would be his approach, and it is an approach which we in the Human Rights Council and the Commission of Inquiry have also followed. President Cavaco Silva urged in a very interesting observation at the end that we should adopt a pragmatic approach. Well, I'm all for pragmatic approaches, so long as they are conformable with the Charter of the United Nations and with the principles of universal human rights. The inconvenient truths that are collected in our report became available in 2013, and they were then available to us. They were then reported to the Human Rights Council in 2014, and as Ambassador O said, they went then on the road from the Human Rights Council to the General Assembly and then to the Security Council. The report deals with the 9 mandate areas which we received from the Human Rights Council, and those mandate areas are the areas that are covered in our report. The interference with freedom of thought, opinion and religion, the right to food during the terrible famine in North Korea in the 1990s that led to the starvation of very many people. The estimate differs, but it was at least 300,000 and possibly as high as 1 million people in North Korea in a population of 24 million. The interference with freedom of religion within, freedom of movement within North Korea and out of North Korea. Discrimination against women and discrimination on the basis of assigned social caste. This is the so-called Songbun system of assigned social status. Detention in a network of detention camps that are established for the control of enemies or suspected enemies of the regime, but also of their families, their parents and their children who are locked up and suffer great hardships. The public executions about which many of our witnesses complained, that as school children they were taken to the squares in the school, from the school, and made to watch public executions, and how they objected to being spattered with blood and bone, but of course its purpose was to give them a dire warning. And then there were the abductions of very large numbers of Korean nationals, particularly young men at the end of the Korean War, as the forces from North Korea retreated to the north. They took with them many young Korean men, and the prisoners of war, and those men were not returned after the end of the war despite terms of the armistice, and they are still there if they are still alive. And the large number of foreign nationals, particularly Japanese nationals, who were seized, an affront to international law which was actually admitted by Kim Jong-il when Prime Minister Koizumi visited Japan in 2002. A barbarous, piratical act on the part of North Korea. And when we did our analysis of this report, we found that some, not all, of the offences against universal human rights were so grave that they amounted to crimes against humanity. Now, the definition in international law of crimes against humanity is a crime of violence as a matter of state policy leading to the death of many of a kind that shocks the conscience of humankind. Shocks the conscience of humankind. That was the definition adopted at the Nuremberg Tribunal after the Second World War. And the international community then promised that wherever there were crimes against humanity in the future, the international community would look to the country concerned to give accountability for them. And if that country did not, that the international community would step in and provide accountability. And so that is what our report contained. And that is what the people of North Korea have suffered. There is no real evidence of any improvement. The only little tiny crumb of improvement that has come to notice is the action of North Korea to ratify the Convention against all forms of discrimination against people with disabilities, and to permit the Special Rapporteur on Disabilities to enter North Korea. That is a privilege that was not accorded to the Commission of Inquiry or to the Special Rapporteurs on Human Rights or to the High Commissioner for Human Rights. We were simply locked out and not allowed to come in. As Ambassador Ho has said, we adopted an unusual methodology for our report. The way most UN inquiries are done, commissions of inquiry, is in a private way, not in a public and transparent way. But from the very beginning, the three commissioners of the COI and DPRK agreed that the only way to respond to the secrecy and lack of transparency of North Korea was to respond by being ultra-transparent. And so we went through the procedures of public hearings and of use of the media. They were invited, of placing the testimony online, and you can see it tonight if you wish to. When it was criticised, we said, go online if you can and have a look at the testimony and reach your own conclusion. It goes on for hour after hour. If you're patient enough, there's an awful lot of material there. And we accorded due process to North Korea, providing copy of the report before it was finalised so that they could comment on the report. And the report is very readable. That's not a blessing that is universal in UN reports, but this one is readable. And if anybody knows a way to get the Korean language translation of the report improved so that it reaches out to all members of the Korean community, I would be glad to know that. It went to the Human Rights Council. Only 6 nations did not endorse the report: Russia, China, Venezuela, Cuba, Vietnam, and Pakistan. And then it went to the General Assembly. Only 20 nations did not support the report. And then, as Ambassador Ho said, exceptionally, it went to the Security Council, and there is a provision in the Charter for procedural motion to go without the threat of a veto. And so the procedural motion was carried, and that put the matter on the agenda of the procedural motion of the Security Council, and that is where it remains to this day and can be revived at a moment's notice. Now, since the report was given, apart from the tiny crumb in relation to people with disabilities, 2 substantial developments have happened. The first is the election of President Moon Jae-in and his declaration of his policy to reach out to the people of North Korea. This is not inconsistent with the report of the Commission of Inquiry. We emphasised repeatedly in our report the importance of person-to-person contacts and finding contact with professional and other organisations, sporting organisations in North Korea. Unfortunately, endeavours to that end have not been successful, but it may be that President Moon can make a difference. And the other development is, of course, the nuclear weapons tests. North Korea is the only state that has conducted nuclear weapons tests in this century, and the missile tests, 3 being conducted ever since President Moon was elected, the submarine launch test, and the maintenance of the 3rd largest standing army in the whole world. So this is the environment that we are talking about, a country with a huge army, with weapons of great destructive capacity, whose supreme leader was seen on international television rejoicing happily at the development of these weapons with his leading officials and military officers. I will be happy if I live to see the supreme leader or a leader of the people of North Korea rejoicing at the improvement of the economic and human rights situation in North Korea, which would truly be a matter worthy of rejoicing. The interconnection between universal human rights and international peace and security is greatly discussed in literature, and its grounding is in the Charter of the United Nations. The preamble to the Charter declares the purposes of the United Nations, and those purposes include the maintenance of peace and security, obtaining international equity and economic development, attaining justice for the whole world, but also attaining universal human rights. And as the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Prince Zayed of Jordan, pointed out at the beginning of this year, the first of those is attaining universal human rights. And that is at the top of the list of the obligations of the United Nations. If you think about it, functionally, obtaining human rights is essential to long-term stability and peace and security. This is because unless there is the attainment of human rights, the nature of the country in which human rights are not attained will be a country which is inherently unstable because it doesn't win the support and endorsement of its people by democratic means, but simply by the use of violence and terror. The motto of the Jeju Forum for 2016 is peace and prosperity. I'd ask you to reflect on each of those words. Peace is not just the absence of war. Peace is also that internal peace of human existence that comes from living tranquilly in countries of peace and countries where they live under the rule of law and enjoy human rights. And likewise, prosperity. Prosperity cannot be attained if the people are suffering the kinds of human rights deprivations and crimes against humanity existing in North Korea. So that the conclusion that I put before you on the basis of the report of the Commission of Inquiry is that there is no accountability, there can be no long-term stability, there will not be that kind of economic progress that was talked of at the earlier sessions today that would be so beneficial to the people of the whole Korean Peninsula. There is the risk of mistakes and of accidents, the risks of cyber attacks, of terrorist attacks, and of non-state actors getting access to nuclear technology, which are such a danger to the survival not only of the Korean people, but of the human species. And therefore, there cannot be peace and prosperity so long as this situation is maintained. By all means, let us be pragmatic, but it is important that we be pragmatic whilst addressing the inconvenient truth that exists in the report of the COI, containing the reports of the many crimes against humanity and human rights violations in North Korea.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kirby. Is this on? Yeah. Thank you very much, Mr. Kirby. I know I saw you when you were so devoted to the making of this report, and without your dedicated efforts, I know that the report was not possible. And he carries it like the Bible, and I think actually the report serves as something like Bible to many people in the world who have concern on this very critical issue. At the United Nations and internationally, North Korea's human rights issue is probably one of less than 10 country cases that are regularly discussed in the United Nations. But for Koreans, for South Koreans, this issue gives us special thoughts and feelings necessarily, not least because we share with North Koreans the same national origin, same culture, same history. So I would like to turn to Ambassador Lee Jung-hoon. If you could share with us, based on your experience as ambassador at large on North Korean human rights for a few years, and also in academia, you have had very extensive research and discourse on this critical issue. What does the title, Why They Suffer, a reality report on North Korean human rights, what does it resonates, especially for South Koreans, but what does this title give you in terms of your perspective on this critical issue?
Well, thank you, Ambassador Oh. I'm greatly privileged to be on this panel and also to be participating in the Jeju Forum. It's a fantastic forum, and I credit the organizers for putting together such a wonderful venue. I might let the audience know that Ambassador Oh, when he was at the United Nations in New York for the past several years, he's been very, very helpful and supportive of our work, not only mine, but of our work and cause on North Korean human rights. He's not only a most respected diplomat, but I think you will also note that he's somewhat of a celebrity on the North Korean human rights for the very inspirational speech that he's made that got carried on the YouTube, and it just went viral. So if you haven't seen the speech that Ambassador Oh gave at the UN setting, that I would very strongly recommend that you see it. Why they suffer, why the North Korean people suffer. And this is precisely what, as Justice Kirby earlier detailed, and this game-changing document that came out of the year-long investigation into the North Korean human rights issues, and it detailed the systematic, widespread oppression of human rights of the people that's gone on for 3 generations, for over 7 decades. So the question, and I'm not going to detail all that, you can see that in the COI report, which is readily accessible in the UN site. So the question is then that we should be raising is, why then does North Korean regimes successfully, from grandfather Kim Il-sung to grandson Kim Jong-un, do they continue with this violations of human rights? And I will just say that, because I'm working with very limited time, that the North Korean regime, Kim Jong-un regime included, is really about the regime survival. And that's been, analyzed quite significantly. So how does it go about ensuring regime survival, two tools, one for external use and one for internal use. External use means that the North Korean leader does not want to turn out to be like Muammar Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein or Noriega. They've all perished, and they didn't have nuclear weapons. That's why North Korea is very much bent on having nuclear weapons, so that it can stave off external pressure and external interference in the way things are done, which is very unique and different and violent in North Korea. Keeping the United States, the United Nations, South Korea, and the outside world out. Internally, also, in order for the regime to survive, challenges cannot be tolerated. No revolutions, no coups d'etats, no questioning of the way things run. So how do you do that? Very, very stringent control mechanism. So human rights violation is inevitable if you look at it that way, right? And it will continue as long as this objective of regime survival remains intact. The international community, particularly spearheaded by the United Nations, ever since the end of the Second World War, we've all learned of this incredible atrocities committed by the Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. We've heard stories of the Auschwitz and Treblinka, and the international community came together to build up a human rights regime so that these sort of atrocities and tragedies would not be repeated. So you have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you have the international covenants on human rights, and they would set up all sorts of tribunals on Rwanda, former Yugoslavia, and Cambodia. North Korea somehow slid under the radar of these human rights mechanism that the United Nations was building up. So it's really, when you look at what the UN and the international community has done on North Korean human rights, it's in the past about two decades. It's when the North Korean defectors, like Lee Hyun-seo, Miss Lee Hyun-seo, sitting next to me, came out of North Korea, escaped North Korea, and started telling stories of political prison camps, of hunger and starvation, of torture and public execution, so on and so forth. Before that, North Korea is such a cocoon society that, it's not like we have certain images of North Korean human rights. When somebody asks you, what is North Korean human rights? What's the problem? With Africa, we get vivid images of what the violations are, or what the problem in Africa is. Middle East, refugees. North Korea, human rights. Okay, is it political prison camps? Is it the defectors? Is it the children starving? Okay. No image because there's no documentaries, there's no photos, no access. So it's these stories the narration that's coming out of the defectors are very, very important evidence of the violations. And of course, the COI report is based on that as well. Why they suffer, I think we already know quite significantly. The world knows. I think the real question that we should be raising here and continue to be raising in all international fora is, are we doing enough? We know what the problem is. It's not a question of are human rights being violated in North Korea or not. We all know that they are. So are we doing enough? Is the sanctions mechanism, is that enough? Well, because North Korean problem it coincides not only the human rights but the security issues, military issues, nuclear tests, the missile launches. There are lots of UN sanctions. But are they enough? Is it the most significant sanctions mechanism you can find in the world. No. Sanctions against Iran, sanctions against Zimbabwe, maybe even Belarus are considered to be stronger sanctions than the ones applied to North Korea. It's only very recently. In other words, there are holes. Sanctions against North Korea are porous. It's only very recently that the legal foundations have been seriously put together in a coherent manner to make the sanctions program more successful. But we should be asking, okay, the Security Council, the referral to the ICC, International Criminal Court, which of course is recommended by the COI report. We know that that's not going to happen anytime soon because of the veto powers of Russia and China. So are there alternative ways to go to the ICC? And I think there are. And we can discuss that later if need be. Because of the sanctions, if that's what's preventing moving forward, can the General Assembly not do more? Article 22 of the UN Charter, Uniting for Peace resolution, have been dormant, but why not revive them? Universal jurisdiction. So these are all mechanisms, ways that can be much significantly investigated and applied, but I'm not so sure if we are. The question of do sanctions work? I think we can only look at the South African case before the apartheid system. So I think the answer is yes, they do work, and we have to start drawing some comparisons when we look back to what the world did in the 1970s and 1980s against the apartheid system. Compared to that, are we doing enough? And we're running out of time. Okay, these are really serious, urgent questions. We're running out of time because North Korea is becoming nuclear. It's been hard enough to deal with whilst it was developing nuclear weapons. So can you imagine how much harder it would be with deployable nuclear weapons? It might be untouchable. So that's the dilemma and the problem that we're faced with. So the urgency of the problem cannot be emphasized more. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Lee. I think a lot of us agree with you that the North Korean regime cracking down on its own people, committing a lot of human rights violations, is not a standalone issue. It has a great deal to do with the regime's need for survival, the regime's need for developing nuclear weapons, the regime's need to continue as a dictatorship. So the question is how we can, change it, turn it around. We have Ms. Lee Hyun-seo, who came out of North Korea years ago, and she spent quite a time in China before getting back to before arriving in South Korea and before helping her mother and brother escape North Korea as well. So she knows a lot about not only the ordeals of people inside North Korea, but those who escaped North Korea, but still are wandering in China. So Hyun-seo, would you like to share with us your experience and especially from the perspective of women? Who, I think the difficulty is even greater for women. Please.
The international community is paying increasing attention to sex trafficking issues around the world, but not enough people are paying attention about North Korean sex slaves and trafficked brides in China. The North Korean people are suffering under the cruelest dictatorship in the world, and the regime forces people to live as slaves from the cradle to the grave, depriving them of their freedom and hope. So only tiny of a fraction of the population are able to escape, and they risk imprisonment and torture and death in search of freedom or in a desperate attempt to feed their hungry families. And men, since in North Korea men are forced or have to work in the state-run company or jobs in a moribund economy, so mostly North Korean women often became the breadwinners in their families. So the majority of North Korean people who escaped the country into China are female. And we, as a North Korean defector, after we cross the border into China, we don't know how to speak Chinese and we don't know where to go. So the only people who are waiting for us are human traffickers. And they are just locked in one room and closely monitored by the gangs and pimps. And their cramped rooms are usually located on the upper levels in the buildings to ensure that they can't escape. And at night, the doors are locked from the outside. And they are not allowed to sleep even from the pimps, so they are only allowed to sleep in the early mornings when there are not many customers. And they start working. Usually they start working via webcam cameras in front of a computer from early in the afternoon to the next early in the morning. And the customers they can make specific requests and instant messages, including demands. The women have sexual intercourses with each other. And they must oblige. They have no choice. If they are not, these women, if not, they are not popular with the customers or deemed unworthy by their pimps, and they are deprived of food. So, according to a former sex slave, her pimp told her that she was not worthy of eating. So after they worked in one discounted brothel, and then they re-rotated to another brothel to ensure so the customers always have fresh faces. And in the end, after a few years later again, the pimps are selling them to the poor Chinese farmers or undesirable men in China. So this is one of my friend's story, actually. After she was sold to the Chinese farmer, the Chinese husband, he was beating her consistently, I guess, and then sometimes his family. And then to prevent her escape, they chained her inside the shed when they are not watching her. And she spent another 8 years there. And then in 2010, finally, she found her freedom by coming to South Korea. And what she told me was, even though the life was really miserable with the Chinese family, but it was much better compared to the previous experience in a brothel. So some of these trafficked women commit suicide, while others hold sliver of hope that they will eventually escape. But I know 3 of these women who had trafficked in China and eventually, miraculously, they escaped. One woman managed to escape on her own, but the other 2 was rescued by a total strangers with a coincidence. So, but they are very lucky, but this is a very unusual situation in this kind of situation. So many more of these women need to be saved. And the North Korean human rights tragedy must become one of the most international community's pressing issues. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Hyun-seo. Let's move to Anna Five here. Anna, you know Korea very well, South Korea, of course. I still remember your open house party at your traditional Korean-style house in Bukchon some years ago. But at the same time, you've been to North Korea 7 times. So you've been constantly reporting on North Korea, whether you are based in Seoul or in Tokyo or in Washington. So would you share with us your thoughts about North Korean human rights situation?
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for that. Ambassador Lee just said then, are we doing enough to help the North Korean people? And from my perspective, I think my responsibility and the thing I can do is to be able to write about what is going on inside North Korea and convey that situation to the outside world. And so that is a responsibility I bear very heavily and something I've really tried to do a lot, particularly since I came back to work for the Washington Post in this part of the world. Having said that, I don't think there is enough coverage of North Korean human rights as an issue, either by myself or generally. Partly that is because there's so much fascination with Kim Jong-un. People just want to read stories about Kim Jong-un eating too much cheese and breaking both his ankles. I mean, I really do not want to write and do not write those stories, but there is this kind of fascination out there with this crazy leadership, as people think that it is. Also, the missile program creates some kind of urgency there. That's a story that needs to be written that day. But then there is also the human rights subject, which I do try to devote a lot of energy to. But it is incredibly hard to write about this situation, and I will try to explain some of it by way of explanation, hopefully not as excuse. So in order, as a reporter, to cover North Korea, we rely on people who have escaped from North Korea, like brave people like Hyun-seo here, to come out and to tell their stories of what has happened on the inside, and also people like Sokil who help journalists like me enormously to understand the situation inside North Korea and to meet people who have escaped from North Korea. So, I mean, without that first-hand account, it's very, very difficult for me or journalists to write about the situation inside North Korea. But getting people who are willing to talk to me in the way that they did to the COI report has become incredibly difficult over the years that I've been writing about North Korea. So when I first came here in 2004, occasionally, defectors would ask to be paid to talk to journalists. That was a practice amongst some Japanese journalists at the time. But this has become much, much more prevalent now, and that it is the rule rather than the exception, partly because of this proliferation of television programs where they do pay people. And I completely understand that escapees from North Korea have very few marketable skills other than their stories. But for journalists like me and news organizations like mine, we simply cannot pay anybody for their information. Like, we have to find people who are motivated by the desire to tell their stories rather than the money. So that is a huge constraint on finding people willing to talk to me, and something that I come up against all the time. But I do manage to find people who are willing to talk to me for free and to spend the kind of time that I do want to spend with them, to hear their stories and in the kind of detail needed to bring the story alive for the readers. And so to do that, I here in South Korea, I talk to defectors a lot, as much as I can, about their situation. I have been to Laos and talked to women, like Hyun-seo described, women who have been ended up working in the sex industry in China because there's no other way for them to survive, and listen to them talk about what they have had to do. there. And this story, there was one story in particular I wrote about a woman with an 18-month-old baby who had escaped as part of a bigger group through Laos to Thailand, and they're now in South Korea. And she described to me the kinds of things that she had found personally disgusting, that she had to do for a few dollars a day. And this was even outside North Korea. So telling that story was very moving for me, and it was a very powerful story, I think, that touched a chord with our readers. I do go to Pyongyang when I can, which is not that often these days, but I don't see anything in Pyongyang that, is anything that the regime doesn't want to show journalists like me. So in terms of writing about human rights, there's not much to be gained from going to North Korea. The place that I do find the most fruitful is going to China. And reporting from along the border there, and talking to people who have escaped quite recently from North Korea and who are willing to talk. But that is challenging in an entirely different way, because these people are living in this, in hiding, basically, living in constant fear of being caught by the Chinese police and being repatriated to North Korea and to, a very grisly fate often there, at least in time in prison. And so obviously I stand out when I'm in the Yanji or this part of northeastern China, so I have to be very careful not to jeopardize the people who are willing to talk to me there, not to attract too much attention to them, not to me, but to them. So there are all of these challenges, but having described those challenges, I'll just add one more thing, and that I think increasingly there is a desire among readers to expect the worst from North Korea, with good cause. There are many, many atrocious and brutal stories that have come out from North Korea, and including the kinds of tales we read about, well, not tales, but facts that we read about in the COI report, which is something, I want to write about, these kind of really brutal human rights abuses, but there's also the much more kind of mundane, day-to-day human rights abuse of constant repression, of constant denial of access to food, of access to information, like Justice Kirby described, an ability to travel around the country, these basic human rights which are denied to people. And it can be difficult to write about this more day-to-day brutality or repression because of the expectation for extreme stories of torture and from North Korea, which obviously exist, but the brutal day-to-day stuff is much more widespread, I would say. And so so these are the kinds of steps that I go through as a journalist to try to explain what life is like, particularly now in Kim Jong-un's North Korea, which is quite different in some ways, or many ways, from Kim Jong-il's North Korea, and to do it, as Ambassador Lee said, without photos, like we've got from Africa or the Middle East, without footage, without people on the ground in North Korea now who are able to talk to us. But it's something that I do try my hardest to do, and hopefully over the next 6 months or something, or a year or so, we'll be able to do more. So thank you for inviting me to this forum.
Thank you very much, Anna. Well, in this particular issue area, I think sometimes activities in civil society are as important as, or sometimes even more important than those of the governments. So we have the representative of LINK, an international NGO devoted to the promotion of human rights in North Korea, Mr. Park Sokil. Sokil, would you like to share your views on this?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think that we've had some really strong statements on the problem, the nature of the problem of North Korean human rights, especially from Hyunsa, but also from all of the panelists. So I'll just touch more briefly on that, and then I'll use some of my time on the mic to go beyond that a little bit and talk about some of the changes that are happening as well, and also maybe talk about some potential solutions. I don't think that there's one clear solution on this issue, but I think that there are things that can be done and done more to bring forward progress on this issue. And so maybe I'll go into that to lead into the Q&A. So just to talk briefly on the kind of problem statement, I think it's key, to note that North Korea is unique for being the most closed country in the world. And part of being the most closed country in the world comes from it being so self-isolating and actually, I think, self-sanctioning as a government. I think that's key. And then another key thing in terms of its maintenance of 100% political control. There are no North Korean dissidents inside the country, in contrast with political dissidents that exist in China, in Myanmar, in Cuba, or in any other country that you could point to. There's no known dissident inside North Korea. There's only the opportunity for people to defect and then become a dissident from outside of the country. So they do have 100% of control over the political space inside of the country. I think that one of the key things for that is maintaining this information cordon with the outside world to prevent most of the information and ideas from the outside world from coming in, but also having such an intensive, resource-intensive, time-intensive system of political education, political messaging, that's really hard to underestimate, I think, and hard to probably even imagine from the outside world, but that's one of the key ways that they maintain political control inside the country, and then backing all of that up with, of course, zero tolerance against any kind of political dissent inside the country. If you're caught doing anything subversive to a significant level politically inside the country, then you will be completely and permanently removed from society. There's no leniency whatsoever. And with that level of brutal repression, it does enable them to maintain 100% of political control at the moment. However, they don't have 100% control over the whole of society. They don't have 100% control over the economy, for instance, or over the information and media space in general. And there's really important multi-year trends happening on the economy. We can maybe talk about this more, these trends in general more, because they all could take their own whole session, I think. But basically, as has been mentioned, from the point of the famine in the 1990s, there's been a huge kind of decentralization of economic control and economic activity in the country. There's a lot more individual agency for people to, and a lot of it is despite of restrictions and the governance system, but to basically have their own private entrepreneurialism, their own companies. There's even an emergence of what some people are calling North Korean chaebol inside the country. These don't compare to South Korean chaebol at this point by any means, but there are kind of groupings of companies. There are, for instance, multiple, I think, 3 or 4 taxi companies in Pyongyang. In a traditional state socialist economy, if you're going to have taxis, then you should only have one company controlling that, and it should be a completely state-controlled company. The fact that you have 4 companies competing in that space shows that there is profit-seeking behavior from different entities inside the country that are in competition. So it's capitalism. The North Korean North Korean government has lost control of the economy. The economy is growing because of this marketization and growing linkage to the Chinese economy. And so that's a significant change and long-term force of pressure for change inside the country. On information as well, a lot of people will have heard about the South Korean films and Hollywood movies and these kind of things being smuggled into the country on USB drives and being used with a growing array of technologies inside the country, laptop computers, mobile phones, small tablet devices. All of these things are being used to break through the government's cordon of information to the outside world. These things are not just purely entertainment, although that might be the primary motivating factor to start off with for a North Korean watching, but it actually contains a lot of really important lessons about China, about South Korea, about the wealth and freedom in the outside world that could be accessible if the North Korean government basically changed the governance system and allowed reform and opening inside the country. I'll touch very briefly on corruption. It's a very important phenomenon of change inside the country. There's been an explosion of corruption. North Korean refugees, it's one of the most consistent things that they say is that you have to break the rules inside the country in order to live. But if you have money or if you have connections, and often those things go together, then there's no rule that you can't break. You can pay bribes to get away with calling relatives in China or in South Korea. You can pay bribes to overcome the security crackdowns on foreign media. It doesn't work 100% of the time, but it does help to mitigate the risk in a very significant way. And it also helps to grease the social changes, whilst, if anything, increasing resentment against the system in general. Because whilst this massive prevalence of corruption inside the country means that people can essentially buy more access to freedoms than they could before, people don't feel good about it when they do it. They're more angry against the government officials as they get more access to these freedoms. There's a kind of irony there. There's also a widely noted generational change inside the country. The so-called Jangmadang generation, kind of North Korean millennials, how they're different to the previous generations because they grew up through a market economy and through increasing access to foreign information and so on. There's a lot more social change that we could talk about, but I think that one of the key broader points to make is that the North Korean government actually seems to be very sensitive and aware to these kind of changes, and they respond with an array of different tactics and strategies. And that goes from resisting to adapting and even accommodating some of these changes. So sometimes they will just crack down on these changes. They will try to roll back some of the marketization and so on. They've been doing that at different points over the last 15 years. But sometimes they'll also adapt and accommodate to it because in the long run, it seems, they realize that that's one of the only long-term ways to keep in control of this constantly changing and actually opening system from the bottom up. I'll touch briefly on some potential solutions. All of these are happening maybe to a certain degree, but I think they could all be done more. So the first one would be increasing information access inside the country. This is being done partly by some NGO groups, by broadcasters like VOA and RFA in the US, by KBS in South Korea. But there's a lot of space to be gone into there. We could really increase the quantity, diversity, and quality, and kind of strategic quality of the information that's going in. I think that there are opportunities through various forms of economic engagement to accelerate positive change inside the country as well, especially if that economic engagement is decentralized. It doesn't go through one major channel through the North Korean government, but it's working more maybe small to medium style ways. For instance, to stray beyond my remit and go into politics a little bit, some of the kind of economic linkages that were shut down by the May 24th sanctions in 2010. And there's also opportunities in a bigger, more centralized way as well. But there's a lot of debate on that, so I'll kind of leave that one there. I think that there's still opportunities and need to protect North Korean refugees and to empower them as well. North Koreans who are escaping the country are not just victims of this situation, although there is a lot of victimization of North Korean refugees, but a lot of these people, and I think this is not realized enough in the outside world, but a lot of North Koreans who leave the country and then safely resettle in South Korea or elsewhere are actually able to maintain contact back into their friends and family in North Korea. And that communication, that information going into North Korea to those communities, and the money that they send, which is really significant as well, is a key input of change going in, accelerating positive economic and positive information changes inside the country. You have at this point just over 30,000 North Korean refugees who have resettled in South Korea, for instance. Out of them, multiple surveys suggest that around half, maybe even more, are maintaining contact back into North Korea. And a typical amount of these people will send is about $2,000, 2 million won, roughly, per year. So this is tens of millions of dollars going from North Korean refugees in South Korea to their North Korean families and sometimes friends every year. Lastly, I'll say that I think that, as Justice Kirby and other people have mentioned, there are opportunities for various non-governmental interactions and exchanges with North Korea. This could be with North Korean people, with North Korean institutions and people. This could be in education, it could be in cultural areas, or it could be in sports as well. So I think that there are multiple opportunities here. I don't think that anything like enough is happening on those multiple areas. And so I think ultimately, if we look at the changes that are happening already inside the country, those are some of the key areas that we have to accelerate what's already happening. The progress that's already in motion and the pressure for change, the pressure for further change and opening, I think that that's where we have key opportunities to actually help the North Korean people on the ground in the long term. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Park. We have about 20 minutes left, so I would like to open the floor for any questions or comments you would like to make from the audience. Yeah, gentleman in the front, please. Can someone get him microphone? Yeah.
Thank you very much, everybody. Chad O'Carroll from NK News. Just a question picking up on what Sokil was saying. Right now, it's illegal in South Korea for defectors to contact family members, to send money, but Sokil's just talked of the transformative capability of those kind of communications and cash transfers. At the same time, there's obviously a tension with national security issues because there's obviously still a war technically and so on. But are there any ways that the law in South Korea could be changed to facilitate those kind of communications between families and financial transfers? I don't really know who to ask this to because we've got Judge Kirby who has some legal background, but anyone who has any thoughts on that would be grateful to hear.
Okay, we will collect a few more questions and we'll get back to the panelists. Yeah, please.
Yes, Tom Coyner with Korea Economic Reader, and this is specifically to Judge Kirby, if I may. We heard a lot of discussion about China and Laos being tolerant of major human rights violations. Of course, this particular session is working or focused on North Korean violations, but if we have third party or second party countries tolerating and almost encouraging passively such widespread human rights violations, would it be helpful down the road to first sanction or at least censure officially countries like China and Laos and possibly other countries as a way of kind of gently moving towards North Korea if we cannot go directly at North Korea? And if so, how might that be done?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, the lady there.
Thank you. My name is Eun-young Jang. I'm from Trilateral Cooperation Secretariat. I really appreciate what you said and sharing your thoughts and ideas. And I would like to ask, because you shared the steps that we can take on the civil society level. So if the South Korean can, the government level, if they want to take the step to improve the human rights in North Korea, then what can it be? And then the Moon Jae-in, the new administration is saying that they are going to open up the Kaesong industrial park again. So I want to hear about your opinion that it will be helpful to improve the human rights in North Korea. Thank you.
Thank you. One more? Yeah, gentleman there.
Yeah, hi, John Delory from Yonsei University. A quick question for my friend and colleague, Ambassador Lee. Your argument about survival, regime survival, and how that sort of drives this chronic human rights violation problem. Is there another possibility where a more secure Kim DPRK regime would then be able to start making gradual, at least some basic level improvements in its human rights violations, somewhat perhaps along the analogy of the way in which China, did make improvements if you compare the Mao era to the post-Mao era? Thanks.
Thank you. Then we will go back to the panelists. I think the first question, right now it is illegal to contact North Koreans. I think that question kind of was inspired by Sokil's explanation. And is there any ways to change the law in South Korea to facilitate such contact? Ambassador Lee, what do you think?
I haven't heard any instance of a North Korean escapee or defector making contact with his or her family members in North Korea, and probably Ms. Lee can elaborate further on this. And they say that even phone calls are quite readily available. And the point is, I haven't heard a North Korean defector, by doing this, being charged with violation of domestic law. In particular, of course, the national security law. National security law is very specific. It's activities against the state that could harm the state system or the ideology and so on and so forth. So I haven't heard, correct me if I'm wrong, I haven't heard a North Korean defector being charged with that for their attempt to, correspond with their family members. And it's already going on quite extensively. And, that it's not really as a result of whatever laws or restrictions we have in the South. That would, of course, explode if only, we could have much greater open access in the North. So I don't think it's a problem of South Korea. It is really a problem of North Korea.
In the previous governments, it was illegal for us to send money into North Korea, but not illegal to contact with the family members inside North Korea. That's why, like the brokers who was sending money into North Korea, who was gathering money from North Korean defectors and then send the money into North Korea. So, under the name of money laundering, they were punished by the government if they were caught. But in current government, Moon Jae-in government, I don't know what happened, they suddenly announced or saying sending money into North Korea right now, it's illegal. And this made a lot of defectors furious right now. I don't know really why, but the reason defector became angry because they said without this legal or illegal, we will keep doing it, and we were doing really well. But after putting this illegal, which means all the information, the legal information, we send the money, all private information, the details will be monitored by South Korean government. So most defectors actually, I don't know if it's proper to say that they are really against the current government. So they are saying they are trying to sell all information on purpose to North Korean regime. So that's the main reason they are strongly against the current situation.
But Ms. Lee, the current new government has been in power only for less than a month. And
yeah.
you are saying that under the new government, it is illegal to send money?
It's illegal right
it's
now.
Legal
yeah,
right
the
now.
previous government was illegal, but this one was legal. So on the Facebook, all human rights North Korean activists, or they are sharing this right now, and then we are discussing about the issues.
But I think it's yet too early to see any changes in terms of law and regulation or even policy of this new government. So I think that's probably speculation. Yeah. Anyway,
can I jump in on that one?
Yeah, please.
So I'm also not aware of any very recent policy changes under the new government. it seems like there's been a fairly consistent approach to this, that it's been technically illegal, right? It's technically illegal to call, as a South Korean, even if you're a North Korean defector, then you become an ROK citizen, to call without government authorization somebody in North Korea, or to have that kind of contact, let alone send money. It's technically illegal, but as Ambassador Lee, I don't think that there's ever been any cases of actual implementation of that, actual prosecution. And basically it seems, and from some conversations, there's just a view that this is a humanitarian thing. And there's, even when there's been discussion of finding headspace to increase sanctions on North Korea and that kind of stuff, I don't think that there's ever been serious policy discussions on going into that space in cracking down on North Korean defectors, remittances to their families and so on. In terms of the second part of the question, can something be done about that? It's not as urgent because it's never been implemented, but I think that ideally the rule of law matches the actual practice, and also there would be some kind of moral power that would come from the South Korean side saying, not just in practice but in law as well, it's so open from our side. We allow contact with the other side explicitly. And it's on the North Korean side that's blocking that and cracking it down. It would give a certain amount of even more moral authority. South Korea already completely outweighs North Korea, of course, for moral authority, but it would be even more, I think.
If I can just add one quick thing on that as well. The defectors I've talked to about sending money to North Korea say that the brokers charge them 30% usually in the fee to transfer the money. So a huge amount of the money doesn't even make it to the family in North Korea. So if they could reduce some of the hurdle here in South Korea and reduce some of the premium that the brokers charge, that would only be good for North Korean people.
Thank you. Could I just make a few comments on these points? First, number one, on the lack of transparency and corruption, that is always in place where you have unpopular laws that people want to overcome for high purposes, and wherever you have a law, which may be in the books, that prohibits and sanctions the passing of money to North Korea, turning a blind eye is something that the people who are guilty of that breach will conspire in, and they'll take advantage of it. And that presumably is what has been happening until now. The more serious issue that I've heard from SKPs and their groups is that the security law and arrangements in the Republic of Korea is very strict and cautious in their getting any organizations put together for their purposes, and that the law in South Korea is very strict on saying anything that is favorable to North Korea. Now, it's inevitable. We've heard things said today that in some respects things have improved. Certainly the economy seems to have improved, though I gather that one of the problems there is money is now dictating things rather than law, and it's just a question of who's got the power, the money, to control things up there. But I would hope and expect that President Moon would look at the issue of making life difficult for SKPs in ROK who may say something or organise in some way that is not necessarily furiously critical of North Korea. I mean, this is a free country. People can have different points of view, and we had a similar sort of thing in Australia in my youth of trying to ban the Communist Party, and fortunately the court I later sat on said you can deal with communists for what they do if it's antithetical, but you can't deal for what they think or what they say, because that's just something that has to be worked out within society, and I'd commend that principle to ROK. As to going after China and after Lao Republic, the Democratic People's Republic of Lao, I'm not sure that one would want to do that because, again, this is a case where the law may be not perfect, but to the extent that it is permitting and facilitating escape, that is something it would take a very formalistic view of law for you to try to step in on the Chinese and prosecute them for letting people escape. The Chinese, of course, say that the people who come through China are not refugees. They are parties to the Refugee Convention. They say they are purely economic migrants. But we pointed out that under international refugee law, if you leave for economic purposes but subsequently find you will be persecuted and have a well-founded fear of persecution if you return, which is the case with many of the people on the border, then you are a refugee surplus and you are entitled to protection under the convention. So I don't think prosecuting, we should be, again, I think, facilitating the people who go to tremendous trouble to escape in doing so, if that is their wish. Yeah, we had an exchange with the Chinese mission in Geneva, and they insisted that we put their letter in our report. So it's an annexure to our report, but so is the annexure to our report, which points out that even if they were originally refugees, or rather not refugees but economic migrants, they can become in China refugee surplus if they find that they will be persecuted if they go back. And we have some horrendous stories in our report given by witnesses to our public hearings who tell of the type of punishment that they receive when they are returned. By the way, we didn't pay any of the people who came before us for giving testimony to us. We did pay for their costs of getting to the place where we took but that's usual in any system. That happens in courts and tribunals in Australia and elsewhere, and there was nothing unusual or excessive about that. And we had to turn them away in the end. We had to cut it off because there were plenty of people who wanted to come forward and tell of the horrors that they had experienced. There's no real evidence that those horrors have improved much, except that the economy has got better for a few. And those few are very powerful people who, when they have disputes, as inevitably arises in an economy, you can't go off to a court to have it settled. You've then just got to settle it as to who has the most power and who can enforce their will.
Well, wait a minute, Anna. Because our time is running out, I'd like to suggest the panelists to consider the third and fourth questions together. The third question, it seems to me that has this kind of classical debate on what South Korean government can do to improve human rights situation in North Korea other than raising and discussing this issue internationally, especially between liberal and conservative political forces. Some people believe that we should help North Korea directly. Some people think we should just keep pressuring North Korean regime. So this is classical debate in South Korea. So I would like to hear what you think about this. And
I just mentioned that one thing that might be done would be to consult the SKP communities in South Korea. I'm not sure that is done. And they are very disorganised and they haven't been encouraged to get organised. And they've been encouraged to be absorbed and to become citizens of ROK, and that's fine. But they still, when I saw some young kids who've got scholarships from the Australian mission in Seoul, and I said, what is it that you miss most about North Korea? They said, friends. We miss our friends. And that's not a very unreasonable thing to talk about. And maybe if you talk to the communities of refugees from North Korea, escapees, they might have a lot of wisdom to add to how ROK deals with this community in their midst.
Yeah. And the last question was because, all of us think North Korea's human rights problem has to do with the need for regime survivor in North Korea. If there were a more secure regime in North Korea, would it help? Anna?
Thank you, Ambassador. I was just going to clarify one quick thing, in that Laos, Tom, is not tolerating human rights abuses. They are turning a blind eye as North Koreans escape. That's part of the route out to safety for North Koreans. In terms of what South Korea can do, through the course of my reporting, I think that one of the things North Koreans are starved of is information. So anything that the South Korean government or South Korean civil society can do to help open North Korean eyes to what is the reality, rather than helping their government, repress them, cut off their access to information, I think could be really transformative. And so when I've been in Singapore with North Koreans who've been on financial exchange programs, and just watching them walking around, gawping at buildings and things, just seeing what could be in a Asian kind of somewhat authoritarian state, what can happen, what is possible there. Obviously North Koreans are not going to be allowed to come and do exchanges in South Korea, but anything that can be done to help expose them to the outside world and help betray the lie that they live in a people's paradise, I think could be very meaningful.
In terms of what the ROC government can do, I think that all of the things that I mentioned before apply to that. In terms of one of the things that Justice Kirby referred to, and the treatment of North Korean refugees and the NIS processing of North Korean refugees and so on. One of the things that's probably unlikely, but I think that would be great for the North Korean refugee community, would be to reduce that term. Basically, when North Koreans come through, and these days actually a lot of them are leaving North Korea and then coming through China and Southeast Asia pretty quickly. It's being facilitated by relatives who have already made it to South Korea, or by humanitarian groups such as ourselves. But then they go through NIS for typically 3 months, and Hanawon, the resettlement education center, for typically another 3 months. And it's quite a lot of time for, especially, if you imagine a 21-year-old North Korean guy who's just risked his life to escape the country and then has to come and sit through 6 months of government processing. Obviously, the NIS will say it's inevitable that they have to do that debrief and so on. For a lot of people, I think that it can be decreased. It depends on the level of information and intelligence that you might be able to get from the person. But for a lot of people, the questioning in practice is actually over in about a week, and most of the rest of the time is just a waiting period. And then Hanawon is, frankly, pretty inefficient. One size fits all, very, not very tailored. If you're a young woman who's just about to join, 4 family members in South Korea compared to an older man who doesn't have any family members in South Korea, you need very different types of assistance. And overall, community-based support is probably better for that kind of stuff. A lot of us here will have had experience of living in a different country, and the best way to learn how to live in that country is just bumping into things and getting on the subway the wrong way and stuff like that. It's not a government training program for 3 months. So there are some wins that could be made, but unfortunately there's probably institutional resistance to those kind of things.
And so, what do you think South Korean government can do other than international debate?
As Anna mentioned, I think sending information into North Korea is really urgent and important. We compare to East-West Germany situation, the people from West, they were sending information by broadcasting to open the people's mind in East. But today, only North Korean defector organizations in Seoul and some international organizations like religious group are doing this work. But if South Korean government or South Korean people are really trying to involve in this campaign, I think we will bring more significant changes inside.
I'll just take very quick takes on a few of the very good questions that were raised. First, on like China and Laos, I'm not so sure if it's a good idea to lump China, Laos, and Thailand together because it's sort of a different situation. China, sure. I mean, it's clear violation of non-refoulement principle, so it should be reminded every time at the UN or in other venues that what China is doing in forcibly sending the refugees back, knowing fully well that they will be persecuted, as Justice Kirby has mentioned. It should be reminded that it's doing something wrong. Now, countries like Thailand, Laos, I mean, these are few remaining routes that that the defectors can take. So. On the one hand, sure, I think it's very important that we engage in quiet diplomacy so that these governments can be much more cooperative and supportive of the refugees. But at the same time, you don't want to rock the boat where this plays up as some sort of a political issue, which could, in fact, have a counterproductive repercussions. Government, we have a new government which is not even a month old. So I think we need more time before we get a better feel for how its North Korea policy will be played out. But I mentioned South Africa earlier because not necessarily to draw comparison to South Korea, but if you have a major problem, human rights problem, like apartheid that reigned in South Africa, the kind of international campaign that's going to be required to dismantle that system is going to be huge, a lot more than what's being put up right now. You know that South Africa was actually boycotted from participating in sports, cricket, soccer, rugby, right? No cultural activities. UN General Assembly did not give credentials to the South African delegation, so they weren't able to participate in the General Assembly activities. All of that and divestment from South Africa, all of those eventually led to the actual dismantlement of the apartheid system and the election of Nelson Mandela as president of South Africa in 1994. So that's something to think about, when we ask ourselves the question, okay, what's it going to take to actually bring about some sort of a genuine, real change and improvement in human rights condition in countries like North Korea?
Thank you. I think you have
mentioned
just quick.
When I was a young person, the only time I ever demonstrated, because I was a terribly respectable young lawyer, was against apartheid in South Africa. And it came to me as a disappointment that when the votes on the COI report came to the General Assembly, 3 great democracies abstained. One of them was Indonesia, one of them was India, and the other was South Africa. So we all have to keep learning and relearning the lessons of universal human rights and of solidarity in response to the challenges of human rights and the uncomfortable truth about the human rights of North Korea.
Thank you, Mr. Kirby. Well, when it comes to what the South Korean government can do, I think under the circumstances where everyone is bracing for the possibility of another North Korean provocation, I think the issues like how to stop further provocation by North Korea, how to implement sanctions, how to strengthen missile defense, these are more important and imminent concerns for the South Korean government, whether we have a conservative or liberal government. But I think if things turn around, if we ever get back to the negotiation phase where we would be able to resume denuclearization talks, then I think having a liberal government in South Korea would probably make difference. But probably we are not yet at that stage. So but don't hold your breath. But that's how it seems like. And thank you very much for all the panelists. And thank you very much for your great audience. Thank you very much.